Oh hell internet! Thomas Hobbes released his great political work Leviathan in 1651, and it's in 4 parts. Part 1 is called Of Man. Hobbes looks at what a person is and how people do things together, and he starts from the very beginning. In chapter 1 he says that everything we know as people comes completely through our senses, and so in the end we really have just like a picture of them in our heads. In chapter 2 he says that our senses kind of hang around in our heads after things happen, and these are called memory and imagination. Then in chapter 3 he says that when you have a lot of imagination and memory, that means you can plan stuff, which is called foresight, and if you do it well, then you are prudent. In chapter 4, Hobbes says that speech is how we put all the stuff in our heads out into the world, and to do this giving everything names is really important. But so is working out how all the names fit together properly, and in chapter 5 he says that when you do this really well, then it's called science. Hobbes wants everything to be like maths, but then in chapter 6 he says everything we do comes from our passions, which come from appetites and aversions. So basically the things we like and don't like make us decide what we think is good or evil. And Hobbes has a big list of emotions which he tries to define, but in chapter 7 he says that even though everything is just like maths, like in chapter 5, the emotions from chapter 6 are really complicated. And this is why we all believe weird and different things, which are our opinions. And that changes how we act around other people. In chapter 8 he decides that if you are good at thinking, that means you have wit, which is made up of judgement, which is being able to tell stuff apart, and fancy, which is kind of like being able to make up names for stuff really well. This sounds nice, but then Hobbes says we only do any of this to get more power, which we always want more of, and so let's start to talk about politics. But first, in chapter 9, Hobbes puts all the stuff we know into a tree diagram that looks like this. In chapter 10, Hobbes lists different types of power, different types of honor, and says that's how we decide which people are worthy. He doesn't talk about which people have opportunities to be worthy, but really no one was talking about that back then. Then chapter 11 is about manners, which is not about holding your fork right at dinner, but about all the different ways that people act when they know other people are around. And this also goes back to the big list of emotions from chapter 6. In chapter 12, Hobbes talks about religion, why we have it, what it is and isn't, what it does and doesn't do, and he also makes sure to say that yes, I absolutely believe in God. Yep. And the same one as the king too. Yep, absolutely. But remember guys, if you say weird things about stuff sometimes, that doesn't mean you're a bad person, okay? Chapter 13 is very famous. We all have different ideas about the world, but we also want to make sure that we are safe, and Hobbes says this is why we always want more power. So if there was nothing to actually make people be good to each other, then everyone would just be scared all the time, and there'd be no reason to actually do stuff because other people would probably just take your stuff. And there's a famous line about how life without rules would be nasty, brutish, and short. But then, in chapter 14, Hobbes says don't worry because there can be laws, and in fact there are already some natural laws which we can all just work out. The first one is we want to have peace, but war is war. The second one is that if everyone is okay to be happy with enough, then we can all stop worrying about trying to get more power. Almost. Also, Hobbes says that these two laws mean that we have rights, but we can agree to trade away some of our rights in contracts and covenants with other people. In chapter 15, Hobbes says he can work out 17 more natural laws which he says are still laws even if there is no one to say that they are laws, although he thinks there does need to be someone who says there are laws and makes other laws, and that's what he will talk about in part 2. But this is what Hobbes calls the sovereign power, or Leviathan, which comes from the name of a big monster in the Bible. Finally, in chapter 16, Hobbes says that when anything is done, there is an actor who does it, but there's also an author who decides it will be done, and that's not always the same person as the actor. When people make deals, then they agree that someone will act for someone else, and the actor represents the author, which is authority. And really, there's nothing to stop people from making deals with organizations, and so that's how we can make a commonwealth or state, which is a way of trying to make sure we can trust people not to be greedy, which sometimes might even work maybe. So that's part 1 of the Leviathan. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.